Carlos, I know you have a background in academia. Tell us where you've been in the university setting.
Sure. Well, I began my career back in the 90s, as a matter of fact, when I stepped into a classroom and started my PhD. As you know well, PhD is a phrase that's often used to basically describe slave labor. And so we started teaching as an adjunct in the field of English, and frankly thought that I would be in the classroom. Once I stepped into the classroom and started engaging with students, I just found it a really dynamic experience. And so, Bill, I really didn't have any aspiration beyond there, but I literally drew a short straw one day and was the representative from the English department to a meeting with a broader group of administrators that included the CFO for the entire system in Nevada, where I was teaching at the time. And, she sent me an email not long after and said, "Have you ever considered academic administration?" And you know how the Lord uses people in your life. He used this person in my life to plant that seed, as it were. And so it wasn't long after that God gave me an opportunity, and I sort of followed a fairly traditional route: department chair, and then dean, chief academic officer. And then I had the privilege to serve as president at Regent University. I was actually working for Dr. Pat Robertson, who you may know something of his career.
Yes.
He's had an extraordinary career in higher ed, and obviously with CBN and so much more. But after working at Regent for a time as president, I was at Ashland University and Theological Seminary, just a bit south of Cleveland, in the wonderful little town of Ashland, and was sitting on the board here at the Museum of the Bible. I was invited to be part of this board, and when the previous CEO was transitioning, the board asked me if I would consider this role, and like a deeply spiritual man that I am, I didn't even pray 5 minutes and said no. So I thanked them for the offer, but was so gratified that God saw beyond my reluctance. And a few months later, my wife and I were approached again, and we began praying with some diligence, and I've been sitting in this seat now as CEO here for about 18 months.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
One of my favorite stories is when Mike Johnson was trying to decide whether he would accept the position as Speaker of the House. He actually sought out the Museum of the Bible and was prayed over here. And I was so touched by that, A, what that had to say about him, and B, just how powerful the Museum of the Bible can be in an individual person's life.
Well, I know our mission is to invite all people to engage with the transformative power of the Bible, and we are both absolute fans of Mike Johnson and who he is as a man of God. But he actually has a photo of that moment when folks here at the museum were praying for him, laying hands on him in his office now. And so it's only one of the many stories that I could regale you in to see how God is working here. And so it really is wonderful.
When you were younger, what single book had the most impact on your decision to go the path you've gone?
That's such a great question. I remember back to being maybe 5 years old, my mother, who was actually a professional entertainer, she and my father met on the Jack Parr television program, where she was the girl singer and he was the Cuban band leader. So please pray for me. But my mom was a phenomenal reader, and she would read scripture to me, but also Robinson Crusoe, which some call the first novel.
Yeah.
And I read it recently to my 9-year-old twins and realized how dense that language was. But I'm a 5-year-old. All I know is these are just words that came spilling over my ears. And when I think back to the prose of Defoe with the King James Version of the Bible and the power of language that washed over me, both of those books really did become incredibly informative and drew me into their worlds, because Robinson Crusoe, as you know, is this wonderful story of survival. And so maybe it's the young man in me, but I've never lost that sort of wonder about adventure, right? So here's Crusoe shipwrecked, and his man Friday then finds him, or they find one another, and he survives this extraordinary experience. And reading that in parallel to Scripture and hearing it read to me in parallel to Scripture, I was just captured again by the narrative. And what I have found, something you know well as a scientist, is that scientists even today puzzle over what it is that draws us into in the beginning, or once upon a time. And so for me to have each of those spoken into my life by my mother was really transformative.
Do you have a favorite book of the Bible?
You know, it's interesting because I feel a little bit like when I answer that question, it's like, who's your favorite child? But you know, it's one of those things where how does not one be attracted to the power that's in all of the Gospels? And to me, if I were to have to choose among the Gospels, I would choose John, because as somebody with a literary background, there's something so powerful about the way John approaches language there. You know, how can you not be stirred by, in the beginning was the Word?
Yes.
You know, as he takes us literally back to Genesis and then, in a sense, expands upon it, helps us understand even further what that's about. But you know, I've been studying the book of Jonah now for a while. I mean, it's just been a self-study. And when I look more deeply into that book, I think of how remarkably complex that text is. One of the reasons I was drawn to that text is, you may know, we have the earliest copy of Jonah known to mankind in the museum.
I'm going to see it today.
Oh, you will see it today. So while there may be an earlier copy out there, we have one from the 300s. So it's really rather incredible. So that's, again, one of those books that you go back to, because people say to me, do you take the Bible literally? And my answer is absolutely. And then they say, well, don't you take it metaphorically? And I say, absolutely, because I don't want to diminish its power in any way, shape, or form. So I want all of it to be part of who I am. And so that's one of the things I look at. You know, so many thinkers have taken on the book in that capacity. But as I read Jonah, I see the tremendous power of just his story and taking it at an incredibly literal level. But also understanding that even our Jonah, it was found in connection to many other documents that surrounded Easter. And as you probably know, Jonah, from the earliest days of Christianity, was attuned to Easter, because this idea of him being in the belly of the fish was clearly a parallel to Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days. So this whole idea that Scripture has that kaleidoscopic power, layer upon layer, that we're still uncovering.
What a wonderful teacher. You have just taught me something about Jonah. And I should have already figured that out, but no, that's wonderful. How did you pick Museum of the Bible?
You know, it really picked me when I describe my entree here. But I will say that one of the ways we know we love something, I know love is something you've thought deeply about and how God conveys his love, but one of the ways we know is when we leave a place, or it leaves us, how we long for it. And I had completed 3 terms as a board member, 3 3-year terms, and left the museum for a brief time and longed to be a part of it again. So that's one of the things I often share. There is something about this place. It is not an icon, it's not a church, but it is set apart, Bill. I will tell you that there is something about this place, and probably not least of which because people have been praying for a place like this for a long time, and we have people praying daily for the museum. And so I think those prayers have paved the way for it to be truly a place set apart where God's Spirit can do its transforming power in the hearts and lives of people.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Each time I come, I'm touched by some different aspects, surprisingly, and that's what's so wonderful about this museum. It has so many different layers. I think today I'm going to go back up to the Bible floor and look at all the collection of Bibles from, 300, you said?
Yes, it's extraordinary. We actually have some of the earliest full Bibles from the 11th century in our collection. You'll see those. Of course, I always stop and pause a little extra long at the King James versions of the Bible. We have 3 original copies of the authorized King James, and because of my own work in Shakespeare, it's that language is one that I know well. But you know, on the 5th floor, of course, today we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not long ago we had an extraordinary exhibit that probed the Bible and science, this intersection between faith and science. And it's one of the things that I've read your book recently, Sacred Science, and it's wonderful, Bill, because one of the things your book did is it helped me understand, even beyond that exhibit here at the museum, that there really is no distance or dissonance between science and faith. Help me understand further your impetus for that book. What was it that drove you to say, this needs to be written?
Well, I will repeat the story of the nuns, N-O-N-Es, and just took it upon myself to, well, then what are they finding in science to substitute for Scripture? And then to draw the bottom line, I realized they have found another revelation of God. They've, in an effort to leave one, they have found another. And they are both powerful and I think mutually reinforcing revelations of the reality of God.
Well, see, and that's powerful because they mutually reinforce the revelation of a single God. And that's where your work differs so dramatically from most other scientists that I read, because most of them will come to that point and say they must make a choice, that to admit that there's a God in some way must abnegate science. You know, I think it's one of the things that I think is so striking in the work of, so many of these neo-atheists, as they're often called, is that it's not enough for them to simply say that science is powerful and that perhaps science supersedes all other areas of study, but somehow they feel that they must also make the point that there cannot be a God. But certainly you don't see this dissonance, but instead you see them complementing one another.
I do. And you mentioned the word love earlier. I see love as the primordial substance. And I see the Bible as promoting our understanding of that primordial substance. And I can't possibly find a conflict between love as we find in the Bible and love as we actually could also find in science. The bond between people, the commitment, the mother-infant relationship. How wonderful is that?
It's so wonderful.
So I think you have found the right place, and the Museum of the Bible has found the right leader.
Thank you, Bill. Well, when I think about the Museum of the Bible and I consider this place and the many people who've come together to make it a reality, Jack and Betty Moores, they are a couple that truly are a force of nature. You know them well, but one of the things that they are committed to is ensuring that we have an experience on the floor that we call the narrative floor that really tells the story of the Bible. We have an extraordinary Hebrew Bible experience, and they really dialed into the New Testament experience, ensuring that that experience would be concomitant and truly on par with this extraordinary Hebrew Bible experience. And I will actually share an anecdote to just let Jack and Betty know the power that that is having. I had one of our guest service representatives, we call them ambassadors, they're on each and every floor, Bill. And one of them stopped me and said, Dr. Campo, you have to hear the story, you have to hear this story. And I said, okay, fine, tell me what happened. And she said a guest had just come through the New Testament experience and they were weeping and called me over and said, please get a supervisor here. And she said, of course, and she called on the radio to have a supervisor come. And while they were waiting, she said, sir, is there some way I can help you? And she said he could hardly speak. He was crying so hard. And he said, I have to speak to someone in charge. They have to understand what just happened to me. And she said, fine. She's trying to calm him down. And he said, well, while we're waiting, I just have to tell someone. He said, last night I was going to take my life. He said, I literally have the pills that I was taking on my nightstand right now. And he said, I felt as though I sensed from God, before you take your life, you know the Museum of the Bible. It's here in this city. Go to Washington and go through the Museum of the Bible before you take this action. And he said, I went through the New Testament experience and I watched the story of Cleopas. And he said, that was me. He said, my life was shattered. In the same fashion that he felt everything he'd lived for had been destroyed. That's how I felt. And he said, I had nothing to live for. I'm about to tear up just thinking about it, Bill. And he said, the moment I saw Cleopas connect with Jesus and know that he is alive, I knew this book was alive and I knew that life was worth living. And he literally minutes later stepped out of that and was broken and weeping. And I think to myself, that's one story that was captured. through this guest service representative and conveyed to me. But I know that the Moores commitment is touching so many lives in that fashion. And I shared it later with the Greens, who were the co-founders of the museum, and they said, you know, it's stories like that, that if it were literally for that one life, this museum, its founding and its creation was worth that. So thank you to the Moores, and thank you to you as well.
That sounds like a wonderful last word to me.
This museum, this is historical.
In this center, this city, is the most exciting thing possible. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you.